coming to close of day. In example, in needs, and in all you say, lay your gifts at its feet, ever strive to keep sweet. Let the beauty of Jesus be seen in you. Great to see everybody this evening. Appreciate so very, very much the presence of each one. To those that are visiting with us, it is especially good to see you. Thankful that you are able to come and to be with us this evening. Whenever we open the pages of God's Word, it is amazing how it applies so well in every generation as to the issues that we face and the troubled times that sometimes we have to sort our way through. And tonight I want to talk a little bit about a topic that I've simply entitled Wise Fools. And this comes from Romans chapter 1. You know, whenever we understand what God has written, we see here that His wrath rests upon those who have the truth, but they hold it in unrighteousness. In Romans chapter 1, going down to verse 18, Paul says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who hold the truth in unrighteousness." And one of the things that contributes to that is that man believes that he is just so smart that he has figured out things that are well beyond past generations, and we just have got new abilities and insights that previous generations have had. And as a result of this superior knowledge, we just can do marvelous things. But as Paul keeps talking here about those individuals who basically know not God and choose not to retain God in their knowledge, he says about them, going down to verse 22, that they're professing themselves to be wise, but they became fools. Hence we have the title of our lesson tonight, Wise Fools. These individuals simply will take the truth and they will twist it to their own destruction. And we can see evidence of that all around us. But recently there was an example aired over the airwaves that really kind of brings it to the forefront to those of us that are, shall we say, common folk of common knowledge. There was an interesting exchange that occurred this past week during the recent confirmation hearings of who is now Justice Titani Brown Jackson. In that hearing, we find that there was a question asked that has received a whole lot of comment, a whole lot of comedy. There's been a lot of things said from all different quarters about a question that was asked to her about simply defining what is a woman. Now, to be very upfront with you, she is a very personable person. This is not any kind of personal attack upon her. She is knowledgeable far beyond me on a whole lot of topics. And so I wouldn't dare want to imply for a moment that her answer was, ridiculous or something that illustrates a weakness on her part, save for the fact that the answer that she gave was kind of an avoidance to the intent of the question that was asked. She was asked to define what is a woman, and she replied that she couldn't do it because she wasn't a biologist. And as a result of that answer, what she was trying to do was to avoid what to many of us would be the obvious, but to her it was the tactful answer to give to avoid any offense to certain segments of the society who have truly complicated the issue even of male and female. And we call this transgenderism. And so she wanted to try to avoid any discussion of that. She didn't want to make anybody mad on that topic. And so she just said she wasn't qualified to answer that because she wasn't a biologist. For those of us, especially that have grown up on the farm, we know the difference. And we've known it very plainly since we were little kids. And the Bible helps us to understand exactly the plan of God and the working of God in this particular area. We would think maybe from generations past, then why would anybody have any confusion on this? But I hearken back to Romans 1. We profess ourselves to be wise, and we can take a detour that makes us wise fools. In Genesis chapter 1 and verse 27, the record plainly tells us God's intention with his creation of things. God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. Not only do we have the biblical record written by Moses about the creation of the earth and how everything came to be, but Jesus was asked a question related to this over in Matthew chapter 19. Now, of course, the thrust of that question had to do with the idea of divorce. But as Jesus is answering the question, notice what he says here, beginning in verse 4 of Matthew chapter 19. He answered and said unto them, Have you not read, just as we did, have you not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female? He simply reaffirms what was going on at that point of creation, and he would know because he was there over in the Gospel of John. Going to John at chapter 1 and looking at the first 2 or 3 verses of John's Gospel in talking about Jesus, the Word that became flesh and dwelt among us, as he says in verse 14. He says here in verse 1, In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him there was not anything made that was made. He was there. He knew what God did. He knew the arrangements that God put in place as he created man and created them as male and female. Recently, I was asked to teach for a few days in an 8th grade science class. And the topic that we were dealing with in that particular unit had to do with reproduction and how the genes work so that we turn out like we do. How do we have the various physical features that we have? And they went back and talked about the research in that, the early studies that were done, and how they were able to figure out how genetic information is transmitted from the parents to the offspring so that they turn out looking like they do. And you have a dominant gene and a recessive gene. And when those are blended together and match, the dominant gene is the one that's going to take control. And mom may have had blonde hair and dad may have had brown hair, but if brown hair is the dominant gene, you're going to wind up with brown hair. Unless there's 2 recessive genes that happen to match up, and then you're going to see blonde hair result from that. Well, you move right on down that chromosome chain, all that DNA and genetic information that God so wondrously put together. And then you come to the gene that's going to determine the sex of the offspring. And the way that science will portray it as they talk about these physiological features, that if 2 X chromosomes match up, you're going to have a girl. And if the material from the father and mother match up and you wind up with an XY combination, you're going to have a little boy. And that's the arrangement that it works out as whenever you're able to match up the chromosomes and the DNA and what happens here. They actually have a way of using a bit of a schematic to show that. Let's say that you take dad's genetic makeup and you take mom's genetic makeup on this particular trait, and they have what they call a Punnett square. Match them up, X's and X's, X's and X's, those are going to be girls. But here you got an X and a Y, and here you'd have an X and a Y, and so that determines whether it's going to be a boy or whether it's going to be a girl. That's the genetic schematic of how the genes work that give us the gender that we were born with. And so we can look at this as simply the physiological explanation for the sexes that God created. We find that the Bible tells us what God did, and science, as it struggles to do, shows us how He did it, how all that matches up, how the process works to give us the genders that we have. Now, in the time in which we now live, there are some folks who have problems accepting what this arrangement provided. In other words, at the moment of a child's birth, physiologically and with the difference in anatomy, the doctor is going to be able, on a birth certificate, to designate whether this new offspring is male or female. But we've come also a long way in other kinds of research and development. And so now they have also reached the point that they can suppress certain hormones being produced in the body, which God naturally intended to be there. The testosterone is going to help a man develop, a lower voice and whiskers and all those other kinds of traits. They can suppress that. They can also artificially add in hormones that would cause the development of characteristics that might be more relatable to the opposite sex from birth. And they are able to add and remove various physiological parts and make one look as though they're different from the way that they were when they were actually born. And they're successful in being able to cause those kind of transformations. But you know what? They can't change the DNA. That DNA combination is in there. God put it there. And you may want to change the hormone structure. You may even want to change the physiological features. But it doesn't change what God puts in the male or in the female whenever they were born. Now, this has caused a lot of concern on the news recently because you have some individuals who have gone through genetic manipulations as they work with the hormones and all of the other sort of things. They have wanted to do their best to change genders. And as a result, there's been a name in the news of an athlete in recent months. Then there's a lot of concern because this athlete is now competing in girls' sports. But the DNA of that person is still male. And while they have suppressed a lot of hormone production, and while they have done other things to try and help this person transition to the opposite gender, that person still has more strength than a woman. The limbs, the bone density, the things that the DNA put in that person are male. Even though they played with that, changed that, and the person now is wanting to call themselves by the opposite sex, they're not able to make a 100% transformation here. And so it has caused a tremendous amount of confusion. In fact, now we're having some laws that have to be passed to say, wait a minute, you don't need to be talking about this process of changing from one gender to another with little kids. Because it really confuses that. What am I? I know physiologically, biologically, what I was born to be, but there's another aspect of this. And this is when we get into the psychological acceptance of what God gave me. How am I going to accept God's decision as to my gender? And there are many individuals who struggle with that. Now, in all reality, the way I tend to explain it is this. Having watched people for a whole lifetime, it seems to me that the idea of masculinity and femininity can be put on a spectrum. And you may have certain traits, certain attitudes, certain aptitudes that go toward the male end of the spectrum. And then you also have the various attributes that would move someone toward the feminine end of the gender. And of course, we easily see that whenever we respect God's design. But at the same time, we understand that we have differences. Remember the story of Jacob and Esau? A couple of twins. Now, Esau was the outdoorsy, macho kind of guy. He was the one that was the hunter. He was the one that did many of those things that we would identify with as being, more over toward the masculine end of the sign, where Jacob stayed around the house a whole lot more. He was very close with his mom. And his attributes and passions and his choices may have been very different from his brother, but they still had their own sexuality. They had their own gender identity. And so we can fall anywhere on that spectrum. There are some guys that are the great big strong football player types, and they have lots of attributes in that direction. There are other guys that would just as soon be artistic and be involved in many other pursuits that traditionally have been identified with maybe a different point in this spectrum. All of it's okay. As we develop our personalities, whether we want to go to one extreme or the other, until we decide that we want to cross the line. And we've decided, I don't like the gender God gave me, and so I want to go to the opposite end of this spectrum, and I want to follow every procedure possible to make me into something different than what God created me to be. Well, the fact is, we can't change that DNA. God gave it to us. That genetic material came from our parents, and we are what we are. Now, over in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, I find it interesting that the Apostle Paul talks about this. The context is different. He's talking about the various skills and abilities that we have, within the body of Christ, and that we're not all carbon copies of each other. But the point that he makes illustrates this very theme that I'm talking about here. He says here in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, beginning in verse 15, if the foot shall say, because I'm not the hand, I am not of the body, is it therefore not of the body? Does that really change anything? And if the ear shall say, because I'm not the eye, I am not of the body, is it not of the body? If the whole body were an eye, where were the hearing? And if the whole were a hearing, where is the smelling? Now hath God set them, members every one of them, in the body, as it hath pleased him. Now he's talking about spiritual application. I understand that. We have different skills and abilities that aptitudes that we've been given. And all of that has a place in the kingdom. But the principle that he uses to illustrate that is the very one that I'm talking about here. It's the idea that there are certain properties that you just can't change regardless how much you want to talk about. I can take a cup and I could pour some water in it, and we understand the properties of that water. We understand its appearance. We understand what water can do to quench our thirst. We understand the characteristics of water, and we identify and can see what that is. What we have happen as we move into this transgenderism is the water decides it wants to be orange juice. And so I'm going to be orange juice. I'm liquid, kind of like water. And so, but I don't like to be just water. I want the pulp. I want the flavoring. I want other things. I want to be orange juice. And so the water begins to argue, wait a minute, water's over here. Orange. No. I am orange juice. I had an interesting conversation with a young man the other day. Well, it wasn't really a young man. You couldn't tell by the dress and demeanor of the student whether it was male or female. And the name that was being used was a masculine name. I quite frankly did not know in terms of sexual orientation what the child was. But where a discussion developed, the child wanted to do some things that were a little outrageous, and I questioned them about it, and boy, they flared up in a hurry as if I was attacking their sexuality. I quite truthfully did not have any idea what their true sexual orientation was, what God made them out to be. But I did find out later that this particular student had quite a history of struggle, because whenever biologically the student was female, but because of her determination to be a boy, at the beginning of the school year, she had decided she was going to use all the male facilities. And the school said, no, that's not going to happen. If they had a special restroom arrangement for people who had questions about their gender and that sort of thing. You can use that one because it's one private restroom. But you're not going to use restroom and locker facilities that are not in line with your biological designation. And it was quite an intense exchange there for a while. But this is where we're struggling, is that we have a lot of people, more of them are very vocal in our society, saying, I want to be orange juice. I'm not the gender that God gave me. I'm a different gender. But beyond that, you've got to abide by that. You've got to call me by the gender I want to be called. You've got to regard me by the gender I want to be identified with. And you're going to have to do it. I'll get legal recourse if I have to. But you're going to have to call me orange juice. Because that's what I've decided I want to be. And so we get caught up in all these whims. In fact, at one point, I read one article that said that psychologically, we've got about 17 different genders that a person can choose to be. It's not male and female. It could be maybe sometimes this and sometimes that, and it can go this direction, and it can go that, and it's a level this way, and it can be a level that. They've come up with a whole new vocabulary. They want to have it put on forms that I'm non-binary. That means I'm not male and I'm not female. Okay, what are you then? Well, whatever I tell you I am. And beyond that, you have to use the right pronouns. If I say I want to be orange juice, you got to call me orange juice. And you've got to respect me and my opinions about myself and play the game. You're going to have to acknowledge who I say that I am. The Bible says that God created us male and female, and the other inventions have been manifestations of the wisdom of wise fools, of individuals who have decided that I can be whatever I want to be, and as a result of that, you are going to be challenged to have to accept the things that I say. In Isaiah chapter 5, we find that Isaiah talks about the problem that we get into when we want to swap all the standards and we're going to make things read the way we want them to read. We're going to determine what is good and we're going to determine what is wrong, and everyone's got to go with my thought on that. In Isaiah chapter 5, verses 20 and 21, Isaiah says, "Woe unto them that call evil good and good evil, that put darkness for light and light for darkness, that put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe to them that are wise in their own eyes and prudent in their own sight." Now, I will readily admit that some folks can get twisted psychologically. They have a hard time dealing and coming to grips with some realities in their lives, and those are burdens to bear and issues they're going to have to struggle with. I understand that. And my sympathies are extended to folks who have so much psychological confusion. But in terms of the biology that God instilled us with, is really pretty simple. You know, some folks may not be able to define what a woman is, but a Christian can. We go back to the standard and simply say, this is the way God made us. And so we wind up finding ourselves at odds with all of those who are saying, wait a minute, no, you've got to bend the rules. You've got to put sweet for bitter. You've got to swap this around because I'm going to be orange juice. And you're going to have to like it. And you're going to have to live with it. And they want us to play that game. And then we wonder why some of our children get so hopelessly confused. Because they're being told that the family unit is not male and female in the production of children, that you can have two daddies, that you can have two mommies. All that's supposed to be normal. And if you don't like the gender that you were born with, we can change that too. And you just sometimes are left to shake your head and wonder as to how do we get here. Paul told us, professing ourselves to be wise, we became fools. There is a story that's often read to children. It's called The Emperor's New Clothes. And in this story, there's a couple of guys who are trying to hoodwink the king to get rich. And so they tell the king that they have a special fabric that they can make clothes for the king. And only people of pure royal birth can see this very special cloth. And if you can't see this very special cloth, then that means you're a commoner. That means that you have no royal blood in you. Well, the king got flattered by all of this nonsense. And so they take measurements and they pretend to be sewing and they outfit the king in all these new clothes. And he just cannot wait to show these new clothes to his subjects, and reminds them explicitly that only the royalty, those of royal blood, are the only ones that can really see my new clothes. And so he puts together a parade, and he begins to strut down the street, buck naked. But, he's pretending that he is dressed out in all of the finery. And, of course, everybody else is trying to say, I don't see it. And my daddy was a noble. I don't see it either. And my mother was the queen, and I don't see it. But they're afraid to tell him because they're afraid that it's going to look bad on them and that somehow they're mistaken and they're not going along with what's the reality. And finally, it's just a little kid that everyone knows the kid's ancestry. The kid is clearly a royal. And the kid sees the king. Mommy, he's naked. And then the king realizes from the mouth of babes came such wisdom. He wasn't playing the game. He wasn't going through all the motions. He wasn't saying the politically correct stuff to be able to go along with the dreams and aspirations of the king. Those fellows then were caught trying to hightail out of town with a whole bunch of gold and wound up paying the price for their deception. And that's what this amounts to, is that in the confusion and in the struggle, there are some people who capitalize on the deception. And that, well, maybe all kids, as they're growing up, if you watch stages of development, you see little kids where little boys are walking along with their arms around each other. They are the best buds, and they've decided that girls have cooties, and so they don't want to have anything to do with little girls, And yet, in our society now, that's a sign of homosexuality. That they have a same-sex preference at, 2, 3, 4, 5 years old. Wait till the hormones kick in and that'll change. Suddenly girls won't have cooties anymore. But at that point in time, in their developmental process, it's just a phase that they go through in our psychological development. But the wise fools are looking for any evidence that they can find to validate the confusion that they have sown. To try to help folks understand that it's a different way than what it really is. I love the way that David talked about it over in Psalm 139. Talking about himself and how he was created and how marvelous it all was. In Psalm 139, going down to, let's begin with about verse 13. He says, "For you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth." God, you knew what you were doing. And David was very thankful that God had made him as he had back here in the biological beginning of his existence. We've got to learn to reconcile these two sides, to be able to live in the skin that God gave us and to be able to do it happily. Not feeling that somehow we got misplaced, shuffled, and I'm all miswired and crossed up. I think that's another aspect of what Paul taught Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 6. When he said, "Godliness with contentment is great gain." It's a wonderful thing when we can see the plan of God, see how it applies to me, and I'm able to accept that. And I'm going to be able to function very well in the arrangement that God has given me. And I'm going to be his servant until the day that I die. I hope that our desire is to be a follower of God, to be a disciple of Jesus Christ, to be a Christian, and not a wise fool. Somebody who wants to speak the right way, being politically correct, to play all the games that the wise fools have engendered, to try and confuse and to justify and to swap what is good for what is evil, make the evil look all right, make the good appear to be out of step and out of time and out of place. Isaiah was saying, woe unto folks who try to do that. Just accept God's plan and be what He wants you to be. Conquer those demons. Do battle with all of those struggles that are going to arise from time to time. Resist that temptation to listen to the crowd and follow the wrong advice, and just stick with God's pattern. Now, we preach that on a spiritual plane all the time. There's all kinds of things taught religiously that aren't right. And how do we straighten it out? We go to the book, and we see what God has said, and we reconcile ourselves to the standard of God. That's how we come out of living in sin and become Christians. And tonight, if there's some steps that you need to take to make your life right in the sight of God, to be baptized for the remission of your sins, or to come back and be straight away, if there's some way we can help you with that, won't you come as together we stand and as we sing.
Jesus is calling,
Calling, calling, Jesus is calling today. Why should I linger, linger, linger? I will arise and go away, away. They are so happy, 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 who to their Savior obey, obey. Why should I linger, linger, linger? I will arise and go away, away. Jesus is bleeding, bleeding, bleeding. Why should I wander in sin? Why to His glory, 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 glad He would welcome me in, me in. They are so happy, 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 who do their Savior obey, obey. Why should I linger, linger, linger? I will arise and go away, away. Jesus is waiting, waiting, waiting. Open now standeth the door. Soon the night falleth, falleth, falleth. Closed are the gates evermore, evermore. They are so happy, happy, happy.